Hello, everybody. My name's Steve Baker, and we're still waiting for Jean-Louis Missika, who is our third panelist, or maybe he would say the first panelist, whatever. He's not here. He's going to come any minute now, but I think we're going to get started, and just let him join us as we continue here. How many of you live in Paris? Quite a few. Okay. And how many of you were living in Paris in 1999? Fewer, but still a few. Okay. I was living in Paris in 1999, and we lived near the Bois de Boulogne, and there was this sign on this oak tree. And it was a sign that said that it was the site where 35 members of the French resistance were murdered right during the liberation of Paris. And there are bullet holes in this oak tree, and a sign that tells the story of what happened in August of 1944. And when we were living in Paris on Christmas night, 1999, there was an enormous windstorm that uprooted and broke 3,000 trees in the Bois de Boulogne and many, many other trees across the entire French nation. And my children and I were wondering that morning if the oak tree with that sign had survived this tempest. And so we walked into the Bois de Boulogne, and we crossed. It was almost impossible because there were so many fallen trees. And we went and we found that oak tree, and it was still alive, and it was still standing. Now, because of this tempest, and because of all the fallen trees, the Bois de Boulogne is a famous place for prostitution, as some of you know. And the prostitutes who worked in the Bois de Boulogne couldn't get to their place of work. And so they moved across the river to the very comfortable town of Saint-Cloud. And their customers didn't know this. I mean, it was difficult to find out. This was vital information for them, that they had changed their place of work, and they had, as far as I know, no way to communicate this to their customers. Now, in the cities that we are moving toward, which is the new annotated cities, there can be many different ways to communicate to people. The traditional way is the sign that is decided by the people who have power in a city, that everybody should know this, that this is a dangerous intersection, that this is a historic monument that people should pay attention to. And traditionally, it's been the people in power who decide what others should know. And this is true in all of media. And now there's this ability for those of us with technology in our hands to create new annotations and new signs in cities. It's a power that we have, and I think it's going to raise all kinds of questions about what kind of information is going to be in the future cities, who, if anybody, is going to have control over that information, who is going to make money from that information, what happens if people misuse that information and lie and slander, what steps can be taken, how is this going to affect art in a city, how is it going to affect healthcare? There are a lot of questions that we're going to discuss in this panel, and I think the representatives in the panel are really well placed because they represent three different points of view, which I hope during this next hour and a quarter will be in heated and fascinating conflict. And I would encourage you all to interrupt each other. And this group is small enough so that we can, we're going to have time at the end for questions, but we don't have to wait till the end for questions. If you have something that's relevant to the discussion to say, just raise your hand and speak up, because, as I say, it's not an unwieldy crowd here. So if you think about the future of information or stories in cities. We have right in the middle here is Charlie Hale. He's from Google. Now Google has the largest smartphone and most popular smartphone operating system in the world, Android. And so they have a lot to say about what sorts of information and what kinds of tools people are going to have to tell their stories in cities. Then on my far right, we have Jean-Louis Missika, who is the sociologist and author and the deputy mayor of Paris for innovation. And so he is interested in how this information is going to enrich Paris as a city, as an urban experience, and the services in Paris. We want to talk about that. And to my immediate right, we have Alessandra Orofino, who is the co-founder of Meo Rio, which is a grassroots organization in Rio de Janeiro. And while these other two, in my vision, represent sort of the power side of it, she represents the new power because she represents the people that until today have not had the power to tell their story or to post their information. And so I'm looking at her as the sort of subversive on this panel.
It's a lot of pressure.
It's a lot of pressure, but I think you're up to it. So I thought we'd just start with a few minutes of each person sort of scoping out where they see the future of annotated cities and where they fit into it. And if I could just start with you, Charlie,
Sure.
Starting with the tools, and then I would go to Jean-Louis and finally to Alessandra.
Sure. Yeah, I think before the talk you said where the power and trees are revolutionary, which is a
That's
way
it.
cooler title, I think.
Did I call her
And
subversive this time?
Yeah,
Yes.
Okay, well, you
I'm a
know.
little jealous.
Names for that.
but
Yeah, right.
no, but I want to start out. I was looking at, we just were handed this this brief of how the talk should kind of be structured in loose terms, and the first sentence is, our children will most likely never know what it's like to be lost in a city, which I thought was kind of interesting. And I mean, taken literally, I think all of us agree we don't want children lost in cities. It's a bad thing, especially parents in the room. But in terms of kind of future generations, this is my first time in Paris. And I did get lost yesterday. Alessandra and I were talking about not having cell phones. And I don't have a cell phone right now, which has been oddly very nice. And so I kind of wandered around and I used those old annotations that Steve talked about of street signs and asking people how to get places in awful French. And it was quite nice. It was, I sat in a lot of cafes and was the least well-dressed person there. So thank you for making me feel self-conscious. And there certainly are going to be new types of annotations, and I'm excited about many of those. I think things like crowdsourced traffic data and crowdsourced mapping are exciting. And there are going to be new devices that we all use to digest that kind of new form of annotations, whether they be smartphones or augmented reality glasses that we're working on, which Alessandra has said that she will never wear, and I don't blame her.
Sorry.
And so if you ask kind of what those new annotations are going to be like, I think my short answer is I frankly don't know, and I don't think anyone can really firmly predict what those annotations will look like, which I think is really exciting. I have some ideas, but I think the better question is, what can we all do to enable those future annotations that we can't possibly predict? And for me, that really comes down to open data. It's about kind of clearing the path, setting up the structure for innovations and annotations that we can't possibly predict to happen. And I think open data is important because it's, in my mind, improves governance. I think it improves the kind of civic relationship that governments have with their people. I think it obviously provides a tremendous value to end consumers and users. And I think if you need another reason, it's really about driving economic growth. I think that openness drives more jobs, and in this economy, that's something that I think we all care about. So,
What do you mean by open data? What's closed and what's open?
So just to use a very basic example, all of us Steve and I traded emails about should we wear suits and ties or should we not.
We agreed.
We agreed not to wear ties. And if you pull up the weather in the morning to see what the weather is going to be, we can all access that data across myriad websites, smartphones, iPads. That data is essentially open, and that's in the US. We have the National Weather Service, and all of that data is made available to anyone who wants to use it. If you tried to find out what time your train was coming after you figured out what to wear, it depends on where you are. Different cities, different states, different governments are more open about making the schedules and times for the trains and stops and all of those things open, and some aren't. Some see that as copyrighted information, as proprietary information.
Okay.
So I want to move towards the weather model where we can all see what the weather is, but across all different types of information. See what those trains are, to see what that restaurant name is. And those annotations, I think, should be essentially made open. That's my basic argument.
But it includes information that we ourselves are creating,
Right.
which raises privacy issues, which we'll get into later.
Absolutely, yeah. So about a week ago, to prepare for this talk, I was speaking to an engineer at Google who works on Google Maps, and he was telling me that about 7 years ago, they were caught in this tough situation where an outsider had taken the Google Maps code and basically hacked it and made what we all call a mashup. So that he had taken the Google Maps code and he'd taken Craigslist, which is a popular kind of local listings site in the US and or globally, and made it so you could say, I live in San Francisco, I want to see the apartments around me. And he created this tremendously valuable mashup. But he had done it by essentially hacking Google Maps. And so they had this difficult decision: should we sue this guy or should we hire this guy? And fortunately, they hired him, and that became what we call the Maps API, which is essentially a way that we allow people to take Google Maps and kind of put other data on top of it to do different things. And the number of examples of, we have Google Maps, people can visit it if you go to maps.google.com, but there's an interesting stat that more people actually interact with Google Maps on another website than they do on Google's own platform. So there are 700,000 websites that have used Google Maps. One example, I've seen people riding bikes around Paris, and I was trying to figure out how I could do that, or I could rent one. And there's a website called I Need a Bike, appropriately named, and you can type in your address and see in real time where all the bikes are in Paris, so you can rent one. And they've used Google Maps to do that. There are examples of people who can report potholes. So as a city government, it's tremendously valuable that you can have citizens that are actually pulling up their smartphones and saying there is a pothole on this street, and that uses the Google Maps API. Other, Bing Maps and MapQuest, others have APIs that are used in this kind of democratized, distributed way. But I think the basic point is that we couldn't have possibly predicted when we launched Google Maps that it would be taken and used in this really incredible way by 700,000 other people. So Robin Chase is in the room, who found a Zipcar, and her new group, Buzzcar, uses Google Maps, so you can kind of find cars around you and donate your car. It's kind of a peer-to-peer car thing. But to me, that power of openness is really important, that you have to kind of take a leap of faith and acknowledge that you talked about Android, for example, about 6 years ago when I started at Google. Eric Schmidt made this comment that I thought was really interesting to an internal team meeting that we had. Someone asked, why we insist on keeping Android open, why we don't kind of add more controls like some other operating systems. And he said, Google, we think we're pretty smart. We have some pretty smart engineers, but we are never even close to as smart as the whole world combined. Like that, opening
Right.
yourself up to that type of openness will result in innovations that you can't possibly predict. So going back to the transit example, the city of New York, I think it was in 2009, actually sued a guy from Connecticut who had scraped all the transit data for the subways and made an app with it. And they argued that the schedules and times and stops were all proprietary information. Yeah, question? Sure. I'm about to defend the city of New York. Just okay.
My company sued the city of New York.
Oh, okay.
Oh,
But to your point about openness. Sorry, my name is Ian White. I'm with a company in San Francisco called Urban Mapping. And so relative to openness, I kind of challenge you when you talk further about the notion of what I call selective openness. So relative to transit specifically, Google was wonderful in introducing this way of many cities to provide their transit data to Google in a particular format, which took a lot of pain away for public transportation agencies. This format is now widely adopted, and it's wonderful that it's happened, but fewer than 20% of the public transit agencies that participate make their data available to parties other than Google. So this is what I very much call selective openness, and do you not feel that you very much have a significant
completely
mandate to do more other than just kind of take what that privileged relationship with
Absolutely.
the agency gives you? So
Absolutely.
what kind of steps might you take to do that?
So one of the, I'm not in, we have a strategic partnership team that actually goes out and tries to access that kind of data for the transit product. And so I talked to some of them before I came and spoke here, because that is not my expertise. And they said that, you know, a lot of times cities want to make their transit data open, but it's a matter of resources. They don't have technical folks that can, you know, format it correctly, to your point about formatting. They don't have a way of putting it on a website or building a website to put that data. They don't have a way of kind of maintaining it. So I think you're absolutely right that as one of the bigger maps companies, we have a responsibility to try to push cities or help cities to, you know, format data in ways that are helpful to others. But I think we really do want other people to be able to use data in the same way that we can. I think that we all benefit from when not just Google, but other apps developers can take that data and do interesting things with it. So I'm in agreement. I think we have a role to play. But yeah, so going back to the New York example, I think the city of New York had this incredible about face where they, instead of actually suing this guy, they said, okay, we're going to create that website, make the data available in a format that's easy to understand. And now there's, you know, hundreds or thousands of different apps that use the New York City data to make it useful for people in pretty important ways. So, you know, I think the two things I want to close with are, one, I think that the crowd is now making our annotations. That's not a totally crazy idea. I mean, I think we all know that. Google Maps, for example, you know, whereas in the past the government was the one that made the street names and the kind of authoritative annotations, we actually crowdsource much of our data from users. And it's, you know, it gives people an opportunity to map their own community, whereas I think we've had this incredible evolution in cartography where in places like Paris and London and other kind of power centers, a few, mostly men, were kind of making the maps of the world and drawing the lines. And now it's this kind of distributed, democratic process of map making.
And more up to date, too.
Yeah, ideally. But just the thing I want to close on is we care a lot about how the internet is driving economic growth at Google, and working on maps, I wanted to understand what the role that map data in particular has in driving economic growth. So I commissioned Boston Consulting Group to do a study on the economic impact of maps, and so that's base map data, satellite imagery, GPS, and I really want to understand kind of what kind of economic growth that type of data is driving. And they're still finalizing the numbers, but it looks like it's going to be around 1.3 or $1.4 trillion of revenue in the US that's being driven by some kind of geotechnology, and around 5 million jobs. So when you think about how goods move, how people find local businesses, how people are more effective and efficient in getting their jobs, all of that kind of interaction and the annotations that I think come from that interaction, there's really an economic reason to do that. So those 700,000 websites that use the Maps API, those are all businesses or individual entrepreneurs. And I think the openness of geodata and annotations leads to that kind of ecosystem. So,
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, let's move on to Jean-Louis. I mean, Paris is an information treasure. It's beautifully designed, and it has it's part of its history is its information. So maybe you could talk about how we're going to move ahead.
Yeah, I agree with you, because when you are speaking about annotated cities, you have to keep in mind that cities have been annotated since their foundations. And so the question is, what is new in the annotation in the digital age? For example, in Paris, in the 18th century, people who lived in a house in a corner of between two streets were obliged to grave the name of the street on the wall of the building, of their own building. And I'm sure that a lot of people here knows Baron Haussmann, and the Baron Haussmann, when he transformed Paris in the 19th century, has created those plaques that everybody knows now for the name of the streets in Paris, the blue ones. And all the city was marked with these street information plaques. So we have a long history of innovation about annotation. And I think that the main difference is that before the digital age, the information produced by official structures, the state, the city, the region, and so on, was on one side, and the information produced by the citizens, by the people living in the city, was on the other side. And it was mainly graffitis, tags, and sometimes word of mouth. So the big difference is that there will be a mashup between all these informations. And that open innovation, open data, open content, and open government will oblige people like me, working for the government of the city, to work together with people who are making tags on their phones and on Google Maps and so on to put information. I think it's a very enthusiastic perspective. It will be difficult. You'll need a change of mind, mainly on the political side, but not only, also on the citizen side, because when you co-produce, when you co-innovate, when you co-conceive the city, you are not in a criticized state of mind. You are obliged to take in account all the constraints which are those of the people who are deciding. So if everybody is a decider, it will change a lot of things, you know. And I hope that it will make people more responsible. And so I think that the period we are living is a period of transition. And of course, it's always very difficult, a period of transition, because you are obliged to keep the old and to give place to the new. For example, in my function as a deputy mayor, I am leading the open data policy of the city of Paris, and it's not always easy to convince a colleague to give way to information, mainly, for example, financial information. A little bit difficult. So we have decided to begin with geographical information, and on the open data website of Paris, you can find a lot of things which are very useful for developers who are working on Google Maps or other kind of mapping. And you have, what is very interesting for us is that we are not obliged to produce all the information. We can give platforms, we can give tools, and people develop and produce the new services and the new information which is needed. For example, Paris, as you have said, is a very old place of history. And the city is not only architecture. A city is not only history, it's a lot of little stories. And if you want to visit correctly a city, you have to know not all the stories of a city like Paris, because you have no time, but some of them. in the fields of interest of yours. You know. So today, for example, we have those plaques, those things, you know, on our monuments, and it's very small, so the story is very short, and it's in French, of course.
Right.
So all the people who are not speaking French cannot deal with that. And of course, you can see in this occasion what digital information can give to you, because you can have a tag, and people have the story, and even the story behind the story, and in any language he wants. And if, for example, there is no Korean, Korean people can translate and offer the application to everybody. So we know that there will be a transformation, a radical transformation of the way of visiting a city and living a city and understanding a city.
Hi. Hi, Jean-Louis. I'm Robin Chase. Just as I listened to you, and as a person who lives here and a person who's been a tourist, when we think of those apps for tourists, it all relies on an open internet, because I'm not going to pay those data numbers. And so it comes to one of the things that strikes me here, and increasingly in other cities, is that Wi-Fi hotspots are closed down because of laws that if someone else surfs for pornography, I get on my hotspot, I'm getting in trouble. But it seems to me that's a profound problem when we think of the annotated city, is we need to be able to let people who don't live there have access to all of those things. They're the ones who know least about what's going on. And an open and free Wi-Fi is something that seems a critical piece to being able to get at what we're talking about today.
Well, it's very easy for me to answer this question, because we have 400 hotspots, Wi-Fi hotspots, free in the city of Paris. We have decided with San Francisco to organize this free access to Wi-Fi together in 2005, I think, and Paris is in advance compared to San Francisco in this installation. And we have in mind, the Mayor of Paris have in mind to organize a free Wi-Fi system all over the city, which is sometimes possible because we have some companies we are interested to organize this kind of things, paying, of course, with advertisement and with roaming. By the way, I can say that when I say that a city like Paris has to organize a platform, it's also in terms of infrastructure. For example, and this point is interesting because you can see how innovation in the past is opening innovation in the future. For example, in the 19th century, Baron Haussmann has organized a system of sewer which are visitable. It means that people can walk in the sewer. So these sewer are very useful to install and to deploy optical fiber. And Paris will be one of the first cities in the world with optical fiber system, 100%, because of this innovation of the 19th century. And you can see the relationship between old innovation and new innovation. So we will have an infrastructure of optical fiber. We will have an infrastructure of Wi-Fi. And we are very happy, and we are very lucky because, for example, in the French Wikipedia, we have more than 11,000 articles about Paris. So the information is already there, you know. You have to organize it, you have to adapt it to mobility, you have to translate it, but the information is here, and you can use it free on the web and transform it to make it a service of annotation for the city.
Right. Very good. Alessandra is going to give us the viewpoint from Rio.
Sure. Sure. The viewpoint from Rio. I'm not sure I have the viewpoint from the entire city, but I can speak for what we've been doing with Mir Rio. Would it be helpful if I just said like 2 words about what Mir Rio is?
Oh, I
so
think,
that,
yeah,
to
I
give
think
more
it's absolutely
context?
necessary.
Because I'm guessing you know Google and Paris, but not Mir Rio. So Mir Rio is a new organization. It's just a little bit older than 6 months now. We've been working on it for the past 2 years, but it's been launched to the public for the past 6 months. And in a nutshell, what we do is try to get the voices of the people from Rio into the political process so that they can actually participate in the way decisions are made in the city. As you probably know, Rio is getting a lot of investment right now. It's changing really rapidly. It's going to host Rio Plus 20 in just a few weeks, and then the World Cup in 2014, and then the Olympics in 2016. Other than that, Brazil found a lot of oil offshore. A lot of that oil is off the coast of Rio, and there is a political kind of alliance between the municipal, state, and federal government that is allowing a lot of money to flow into the city. With that, Rio is changing really quickly, and I believe it's changing for the better. But because that urban change has been so quick and so aggressive in a way, people's voices are not necessarily part of the process. So we advocate for more citizen participation in the way urban planning is conducted and decisions are made in the city. And part of that, just to go back to your earlier question about the future of annotated cities, I think part of that battle really is being fought in the realm of information and how you actually handle information. Who decides what kind of information about the city is being displayed and how. So when you asked us about the future of annotation, the first thing that I thought is that really, like, to your point, I don't think it's possible to know what kind of tools we'll have in 5-10 years. Maybe somewhere in Google knows, I don't know. But what's really interesting to me, at least, is not necessarily what kind of new shiny gadgets we'll have, but more what kinds of people will actually be annotating the city. And this whole movement of crowdsourced information has really changed the balance of power in a way that is really exciting, I think. Because now big companies like Google or city governments like the city of Paris are actually relying on people to give them their input. So Google cannot really have, it wouldn't have as good of a product if people weren't giving Google essentially free labor by giving all this data to Google and helping it build an amazing platform with all this amazing valuable information. And the same goes for cities that are trying to get citizens more involved in the way they actually annotate their own cities. So get them to report potholes, for instance. If people just don't do it, the platform loses its value. And that puts people in a very promising position of power because they're actually the providers of the very valuable input. And that changes the dynamics really profoundly. So I hope that the future of the annotated cities will basically be twofold, that on one hand, people will actually be aware of the power they have and be more conscious about how they give it away and what they do with it, that they will actually tell their own stories through those platforms. But on the other hand, that they will also start curating more, because really, like in a world of so much information, the curator wins, right? And right now, the curator is the city government or the big company, which is great for many reasons, because they have a lot of resources to do an amazing curation of information. But that means that, out of the 11,000 articles about Paris, someone somewhere is choosing which one gets the most attention or which data we use. So I think people have to start doing their own curation. And I think that's what we're trying to do with Milhiu, and it's a challenging thing to do. But it's an interesting inflection point, I think. The other point that I was going to make is that aside from curation and just getting that power and doing something with it, there's also the kind of data that we actually open. If you look at, to give an example from Rio, the city of Rio just recently partnered with IBM to build a control center for the city. I visited and it's amazing. It's a beautiful initiative. You have this amazing high-tech place where you get all this information, real-time information on the city of Rio, on things that range from weather to traffic information and all of that, which is great. but other pieces of critical information are not being released to the public with the same level of professionalism and ease. So when it comes to traffic, for instance, it's now fairly easy to get high quality information on traffic conditions in Rio in a way that it wasn't 4 or 5 years ago. And I know a lot of developers from the hacker community in Brazil that are trying to do amazing things with that data, which is exciting and promising. On the other hand, we have a chronic problem of bad public transportation in Rio, which is also related to traffic, but critical information on how public transportation systems are run, who owns the concessions is usually by like private companies that win processes for concessions and then hold those monopolies essentially on the public transportation system. What are those contracts? How do we know how much money they make? When there's a fare increase, how do we know that fare increase is fair? And access to that information is much harder than gaining access to traffic information. So aside from curating the information better, being more judicious about when we give information and how, I think the future of the annotated city will be much brighter if people actually start demanding information that matters to them instead of waiting for big institutional players to release information that doesn't matter to them. Was I subversive enough?
Good. I'm gonna try and pick a fight between these two over here.
Oh no, we'll be friends by the end, I promise. We'll have
What
coffee.
if, now imagine, Google gets all of this data and people walking around with their Androids and they have all these interests in things like transit, health, and many other areas that they're only beginning to explore. What if a company like Google that makes money comes up with a killer app for something about public health in Paris that is really useful to all Parisians about maybe what diseases they have or the quickest route to the hospital that most effectively can deal with whatever they have. And only people with Android phones can get that service. What does the city of Paris think about that? How would you get how would you get such a great app for everybody and democratize it?
Well, I think you you are asking a very important question, because I'm not. I don't want to say bad things about Google. Of course, everybody loves Google, but we can say we can ask some questions. The motto of Google was "Don't be evil," and the main question for me is. All these big companies, and it's not only Google, but maybe also the social medias and so on, have a political responsibility. They are not simply private companies. They are, in my opinion, they are private political institutions. And they sometimes, maybe, there will be a competition between public political institutions and private political institutions. On those kind of questions, you are making a public service, a service of general interest, and you are making money on it, and you refuse to give it to everybody, to all the citizens. Or you are managing such a huge amount of information, big data, that you can even know everything about the citizen of a country or of a city. Now, generally, when you ask this kind of question, people answer, well, auto-regulation. But I think that auto-regulation is bullshit, There is only one regulation, which is public regulation. So the regulation by myself, of course, everybody is regulating himself, but in his own interest. So I think that we have a lot of very interesting political questions to deal in the future about not only annotated city, but crowdsourcing, cloud computing, open government, and relationship between people who are managing information, and people who are using information. And the main problem is that the Google is a world company, and Paris is a city, and France is a country, and even United States is a country. So the question is, what is the right level of negotiation? Where can we have this kind of discussion, this kind of negotiation? And we have to invent a new world commerce organization, world trade organization for information, in order to have a world regulation. Because you can have a European regulation or an American regulation, but it's not enough, because the question is relevant for the planet. And we have seen how difficult it is to have this kind of negotiation on the warming of the climate. And the failure of the Rio summit was a good example of, or the Copenhagen summit was a good example.
Don't announce the failure before it happens.
I'm sorry, it was Copenhagen. Was a good example of what what kind of problem we will have in this kind of negotiation. So you were right. I think that on the agenda, on the political agenda of the next, let's say, 50 years, this question will be at a very high level.
So Charlie, was I unfair about is that the scenario that I described, is that,
you weren't being unfair. I think it's important you hold people with power accountable and make sure that you can, hold them accountable. And it's not, we have a business interest in making people feel like they have control over their data, because if they didn't, they could leave us. Right. So there's actually a team within Google called the Liberation Front. And they kind of are proud of their independence, I think, from the rest of the company. And their entire mission is to basically go around to every team at Google and make sure that the users of that team's products can, at any point, kind of export their data or back out their data, called Google Takeout. And, of course, like if we were to have a health product and you have private, your private health records, for example, it's very important that you have control over that. So I am not going to disagree with you. That
how about his point for the need for regulation?
Yeah, I mean, we make this argument all the time. We argue that information is an export. It's something. It's a tradable thing. And I think your example of climate change is an appropriate one, because I think we're at this education phase where we will sometimes sit down with governments and they'll say, well, we need to make sure that the data for, Slovakia, I'm just using that as an example, needs to stay in the jurisdiction of Slovakia. And we have to explain to them that information flows globally, and we can't, we have data centers all over the world, and we can't kind of slice up the data in the kind of traditional format of national states. So I think we're at the phase where we need to educate people about how the internet's structured and how that information flows. And for countries that are restricting the flow of that data, it really should be seen as a trade issue. So I agree.
I have a point about that. As I was listening to you suggest a regulatory authority, essentially, for information, I don't know. The first thing is that if Google did develop an app like that, and if by any chance Google didn't want to release it to the public, I think we would run into very similar issues that we already run with a lot of other companies that produce things that are valuable to the public. If you take medication, or I think the list could go on and on. Like, companies should not necessarily release their IP to the public just because it's useful. Maybe they should, but they don't. The difference, though, with whatever Google could come up with, to your point, is that people are probably going to be a part of producing it. It's going to be their data. If they do come up with a faster way of going from someone's house to the hospital, it's probably going to be by relying on thousands, millions of people reporting on the best ways to do that. So my argument would be that better than government regulation in this case would be for the public to actually organize to regulate the company themselves. Because in this case, I do believe that people hold a lot more power than government. Google doesn't necessarily need government that much, but it does need people. They're their consumers, and they're the ones producing their product, basically. So it's a very interesting position of power that I think could actually lead to more accountability on the company side than any initiative taken by the government.
Well, I think we have this motto of following the user and all else will
Exactly.
follow kind of thing, but I think it's a political statement too. It's a, if your users aren't using your product, there's something wrong. It's probably just not a good product. So we actually have more.
The users are the ones who can force you to do things.
Exactly.
So you saw the Google guys say it, so you should take that into consideration.
I think that, just one word about that. The main problem with web services, web technology, is that it's creating natural monopoly. And it's very strange because generally an emerging industry and emerging technology don't create monopolies. You have the monopolization is after 50 years or 100 years. For example, in the automotive industry, the monopolies have been built after 60, 70 years. And in the field of web industry, you have big monopolies. And Google is a monopoly, and Facebook is a monopoly, and eBay is some kind of a monopoly. And of course, when you have a monopoly, you are obliged to raise question of regulation, because you cannot count on the market to make a natural regulation.
But do you mind if I kind of
Go ahead.
Yeah, I think there's also a difference between companies that are successful and, you know, you obviously don't want to tax success in that sense. You don't want to say, because you are successful, we should do something. But I think you need to look at the practice of a company and say, do you put the right controls in place that allow people at any point to not use your service? And I think that's our basic philosophy, is that competition is a click away. If you don't like Google services, or at any point you want to back out your data, you are 100% entitled to do that.
Right.
I think where you get into problems is where you create that dependence and then don't give anyone a way to not.
There's a lot of people who want.
Yeah, I'm probably not going to say
Okay.
anything else on that because it gets into touchy areas. But
I'm Jolie from China, Horizon Consulting Company, and I'm kind of a Google hater. So partly because
Great.
Google I'm using in China is heavily annotated by dictatorship. Always use that phrase.
Mhm.
I think we talk a lot about the hyper-connectedness of future city. But do we need to first ask one question, very, very simple question. Do we need a consensus to march into a digitopia? Do you need a consensus to really go into a epoch? That's the first one. And if that's the question is yes, have you ever considered probably someday our next generation will come up with one campaign, which is digital Zionism, deconnected from the cyber world? Because as a Chinese, from a net-breaking speed developed in terms of development, I seriously doubt the words of progress. I truly believe in retrogress. So what would be your response on that?
That's I will pick up on parts of that. I think my general comment is that, and it's something that we've talked about on the panel, which is, and I think what you're getting at is you have this kind of basic conflict, this existential conflict between traditional political structures and how states are structured and the laws of those countries, and how the internet is structured. And those two things are a bit at conflict because like I said before, the internet can't be kind of neatly fit within the jurisdictions of different countries. So, Google and many other internet companies haven't been perfect in how we've tried to navigate those, but it is a challenge. We, do have to follow the national laws and jurisdiction, or national laws of the jurisdictions where we operate. And to the extent that we, are have assets in that country and are kind of launched in that country, we need to obey those laws. And so it's an issue of kind of navigating those tricky legal situations and also wanting to provide something that is uniform and useful to as many users as we
But
can.
I want to keep the conversation on the annotated city.
Yep.
I mean, Google's got big issues with all kinds of countries.
sorry,
And so, no, that's fine. Yes.
My name's Joel. I actually live in Beijing, so very familiar with the way that Google is, let's say, censored to a little bit. Keeping to annotation, keeping to storytelling. Oral traditional storytelling is the oldest form of communicating values and so forth. In history, that's how we came to tell our stories digitally. Every story has its parameters and also its rules. So you guys are all agents. You're the storytellers. You're the catalysts. Our heroes, who are us and yourselves in certain circumstances, have these challenges that we need to face. And in your roles, I'm asking you as individuals, what do you see as the biggest challenges that us as the heroes are facing in our journey in a digital city?
Who wants to go first for that one?
Well, it's difficult to answer to this question because, of course, there is a traditional narrative of stories in our cities and in our countries, and the heroes are not the people but the great men. Generally, great men and not great women. We have some great women. For example, Marie Curie. We are going to make to honor Marie Curie tomorrow afternoon. But so the storytelling of a city is somehow a storytelling of great men and great women who have been heroes of the city, and all the wall of Paris are full. The name of the streets are the name of the people who have made Paris, who have made history in France, in Paris, in the world. And of course, when you are looking at the wisdom of crowds and the open government, the new ideas, the idea of the 21st century is that people is a hero. So how do you make a narrative where the hero is not one individual but a lot of people? And in fact, we have the beginning of the answer, because when you look at Foursquare, you see thousands of people saying that they are the mayor of Paris, or the mayor of the CNIT, you know, and there is a fake struggle to become the mayor of Paris. But we know that the narrative will change and the storytelling will change. We have a beginning of that on the traditional news media, what we call story of human interest. And when you say story of human interest, you mean I am going to speak about somebody who is not a chairman or a hero, but who is an ordinary people. But ordinary people also have a story and also have things important to say. So we will see a transformation of the narrative of the city. And I think this change will be the most important one, more important than technology, more important than institution and regulation.
What I want to just add one another response to that. I did a story when I used to be at Business Week, and I did this story on this company called Sense Networks. Do any of you know Sense Networks? They take enormous amount of cell phone data, and they feed this data to computers that are equipped with all kinds of machine learning algorithms. And so if you look at each user, and it shows everybody's movements, and these are just anonymous black dots. And it starts out as black dots, and you see them on the metropolitan map of New York. You see the commuters stopping at every stop. You see the people moving from one neighborhood to the other and moving. The computer, over the course of several weeks, begins to learn about these dots and begins to group them by their behavior so that the dots begin to take on different colors. So pretty soon you've got green dots and red dots and blue dots, each one representing a person. And these dots are seen as tribes, behavioral tribes. And you can begin seeing the shifting, you can look at the geography of a whole region, not by its rivers or by its roads, but by the movements of its tribes. And so that a certain neighborhood of New York is really a different place at a certain hour because a different tribe is inhabiting it. And so we as people are those dots that are creating these, and with the help of technology, we're seeing ourselves as tribes, and those tribes tell stories. So that's one thing, and I think it's.
May I
Yeah.
give two other examples
Right.
in the same direction? In our experimentation, smart furniture for the city, we have created with JC Deco a panel where people can send a tweet, and you see it on the panel. So you have these live tweet walls in the city where people can say things about what they feel, what they want, or what they love. And last year, in our big manifestation called Futur en Scène, where we have a digital week with a lot of experiments in Paris, and the next one will be in June. And there have been a very interesting experimentation, like the one you have described, but it was more about feelings. People put information on their tweets, on their feelings, and there are concentration of this information, and the map of Paris with all this I like, I dislike, moving on the map. And it was very interesting because it was a way to see Paris in a radically new. You never see the city like that. So I think that it's only the beginning, and there will be new concept and new ideas, much more interesting. But it's the beginning of something, of crowdsourcing of information and visualization of this information, and using this information to have a new view of the city.
Back there, you've been having your hand up for a while.
Okay.
Hi, my name is Lawrence Jones with Alstom. Very excellent panel. Over the past 28 years, I've had the opportunity of living in 5 different cities. I lived in Monrovia, Liberia. I lived in Stockholm. I lived in Paris, Seattle, and now Washington, D.C. And over the years, I've seen these, I've had the opportunity to visit these cities again. A lot of time I'm back in Paris, and I've seen these cities evolved. And this whole information of the annotation of cities is one that I want to ask a question by stepping back and maybe looking at, stepping back but also looking at the future, in the sense that a lot of the discussion we're having here today about cities is always about big cities. And we have to remember that we cannot depopulate the rural areas of countries just because we're looking at cities becoming sort of a melting pot where everyone comes together. So as we talk about the annotation of cities, I'd like to expand the discussion to maybe talking about the annotation of the rural areas, because we cannot have 3 billion people living in one big city or several big cities. We still have to think about the rural areas. So what are your thoughts on how this concept of annotated cities can be expanded to looking at annotated villages? And my other question has to do with the value of data. What is the cost of data in the sense of making these systems annotated? And then lastly, one that goes to the deputy mayor and to the gentleman from Google is, as we become dependent on these platforms, who bears the risk for bad data? Because a lot of the citizens in the communities do not have perhaps the right knowledge of understanding or deciphering when data is correct or incorrect. And so if I'm depending on Google systems for healthcare, for example, and I get bad information from that system, who is responsible? Who bears the risk? Thank you.
Right. I think that last issue is especially interesting, and it's reflected in what's happened in media. You used to have media companies that dictated what was truth and what wasn't, and they had editorial operations, and now it's much more crowdsourced, and we're going into the same thing with. Do either of you want to respond to anything?
Not right now. No, I'll let you talk.
Okay. No, it's definitely a challenge. It's even in the realm of mapping, I think Wikipedia has similar challenges. Any platform that's crowd-based, certainly the crowd is powerful, but is there a role for curation? Is there a role for some kind of authoritative source to say, actually, no, that's incorrect? My mom's a big grammar person, and when I was a kid, she would say, "How are you doing?" I said, "I'm doing good," and she would always correct me and say, "I'm doing well." And I think grammar is like one of those interesting things where, if enough people say it, President, I think Harding said, we're returning to an age of normalcy. And normalcy wasn't a word, it was normality. But he used it, and he's the president, so he's allowed to make up words. And that now is a word that we all use.
I mean, Google spelling is based entirely on how people spell, not what's right.
Right, and I think that's, my dad's a 7th grade teacher, and tells his students, everything you get off the internet isn't necessarily right? I mean,
Right.
Google is not the authority on everything, nor are many other websites. And so I don't really have a good answer for you other than that I think we need to educate people that the internet can be tremendously valuable, but isn't necessarily always the be-all, end-all, the authority. And getting back to your point about rural areas, I think some of the same things that we're seeing as valuable tools in cities are similarly useful in rural areas. I think crowdsourced mapping is a good example of, you have some parts of the world that either have, kind of older colonial maps or have never really been mapped indigenously before. And with online platforms, that's now becoming a possibility. So small towns and rural areas that were essentially blank don't have to be anymore. So,
But they don't have the power of the massive data that big cities have to learn, to have all this discovery from big data. It's a
Agreed.
limitation that they have.
Agreed.
Jean-Louis, did you want to add something?
Well, of course, curation is a big issue, and I think that in the phase of transition, we know one of the most important change is who are the new gatekeepers. And of course, it's very difficult to answer this question. But there is another question which is very difficult. It's what is exactly bad data? Who decide that this data is bad and this data is good? If you ask the question to the Syrian government, for example, what is bad data, you will be surprised of the answer.
Right.
So we must be very careful with this question, because censorship is not very far from asking this kind of question. And I think that what is interesting with open government and crowdsourcing is that you can check that the good data is chasing the bad data. For example, one of when I began the open data policy in the city of Paris, some colleagues said, well, our data are fantastic, and if we open the source, the code source, it will be disturbed, and of course in the bad way. And what is very interesting is that all the annotations which have been made by developers or citizens are going to improve the quality of the data. Mm-hmm. They show us that this data was not good, and this information was unavailable, and so on and so on. Well, so you as far as I can check on my own experience, you are going to generally you improve the quality of information.
that brings me to a point that I learned from Alessandra yesterday that I want you to talk about.
Sure.
About bad or questionable or debatable data, and that's a little fight between you and Charlie.
Not a fight.
I thought we agreed we weren't going to talk about it.
Sure. No, I was telling our lovely moderator that in Rio there was a recent discussion on bad data. Basically, Google Maps was portraying slums in the city with the same, how should I put it? They had the same place in the hierarchy of information as bigger and sometimes not even bigger, but wealthier neighborhoods. And the city of Rio sued Google for it.
It was about fonts. Right?
Yeah, the fonts were too big. So the city of Rio sued Google for it, saying that to a foreign eye, it looked like Rio was a sea of slums, which is not entirely untrue, actually. But clearly, the city wasn't happy about that. So they sued Google. Google didn't really do much for a while, and then the biggest daily newspaper in Rio did a story on that. That was motivated by the editor's wife trying to find a shop on Google Maps and being lost in the sea of slums. So after the city's newspaper did a story on it, Google a few days later, a couple days later, made a public statement saying that they would change the fonts, and now all slums in the city, which are not considered by institutional power as neighborhoods, are going to be portrayed with smaller fonts so that you can only see them when you zoom in, regardless of their size or population. So that was a big, big interesting debate on what is bad data and who actually makes that call. So I think her point is absolutely right. In this case, the city was trying to make a call on what they judged to be bad data, of course, to people who live in those neighborhoods. That's just where they live, and that's how they portray public space. So it's very interesting. Also, like knowing that a lot of Google Maps can be edited by normal citizens, it begs the question of like, why didn't people just edit it themselves if they could? So was that previous portrayal of the city how people actually saw it, or is the new one how people actually see it? Is the new one how we want people to see it, but in the future? What is the vision of the city that we're trying to kind of convey through that map? And who's making that call? It was definitely a big old institutional player. It was the city. It wasn't some new, hot, and sexy crowdsourced process.
Right, and the city had its economic interest in this, and it wasn't necessarily
Absolutely.
truth, because maybe this, who knows
makes
how
that
they
call?
should be
Yeah.
labeled.
And that example is, we have political examples of that too. So going back to Syria, the Syrian government contacted us to say that, you're showing, because people were changing the names of streets in Syria to, the names of revolutionaries and people who had died. And so they came out kind of lambasting Google for being on the side of the revolutionaries. What's that? Those are the heroes,
Yeah,
exactly.
And those are the stories that would, to your question before, my answer to that question was going to be that a lot of our heroes' stories are just more convenient, left untold. So
Yeah.
that's, for me, the biggest challenge.
But just going back to your question of challenges too, because I think that was a really good question. I think, not to end, I don't know if we're ending soon, so I don't want to end on this note, but
we've got 5 minutes.
yeah, so I think, unfortunately, the internet, that platform, which I think should be where those stories are being told by the heroes, as you put it, is really under attack by political structures. I think we've all seen the SOPA bill that popped up in the US, and that was a bill that was more similar to some of the internet censorship laws that we've seen in places like Syria than you would ever expect from, a kind of forward-looking democracy like the United States. So I think there are still lots of challenges to the internet. There are new bills that are coming out that are much like SOPA. And for those of you who don't know, it basically, under the very important guise of protecting copyright and piracy, it basically gave the ability to kind of shut down the internet or shut down certain sites that were deemed as kind of infringing copyright. And it was this very dangerous slippery slope where it kind of gave the ability to censor the internet. And so I think the biggest challenge to the storytelling that you're talking about is these types of laws that can kind of kill the open internet. And I think we all have a responsibility to protect that.
One last question. Yeah. No, right here. Oh, sorry. I'm sorry. Well, two last questions. You can do it after. Sorry. We'll make it quick, though. Uh-huh.
Want to come here? You want to come here? Just come here. Hold on.
Yeah. This is a bit awkward. Hi, everybody. Guest speaker. My name is Lorenzo Fornari, and I'm based here in Paris. I'm a co-founder of a company called Juste en Face. Been around for 6 months, and it kind of involves everybody here. So first of all, thank you for all the open data that you do provide, because we use it constantly. That works now? Okay. Sorry. And another one is also where we do annotation. It gives the people ability to geolocalize data that you create. So hyper-localized classified ads, events. It allows people, I'm here because about the concept of urbanization and annotation and letting people both contact each other but also to explore each other's neighborhoods, rediscover neighborhoods. When we were looking at what to use as an API, as mapping, we obviously looked at Google and Bing and whatnot. One of the questions we had when we were doing it is what kind of guarantees, maybe 5, 10, 15 years down the line, do we have that the data that's being created with your APIs will still be around or not censored? For example, you were saying in '99, people were trying to find where the prostitutes were. What if they used Google Maps to recreate sort of an annotation?
Open street maps, maybe.
Street maps. And infused in that is the latest, for example, is Apple moving away from Google Maps using OpenStreet data? Is that a political move or is that an economic move, for example?
I cannot speak for Apple on that topic. I wish I could. No, it's an important question, and people make an investment with their data in products like Google's products, and whole businesses are built on it, and you need to be insured or you need to know that data is going to be there and that platform is still going to exist. So my short answer is I think it will be there. The Google Maps API I think is the most popular API on the internet. If you took the other 10 APIs and stacked them up, it would still be the most used. So we tend to kind of follow the wisdom of the crowds, and if people are telling us that our products are useful, we will continue to support those. And in the cases that they're not, there are still very vocal minorities sometimes who use a product that isn't really successful, and so we try to give them a way to retain their data and take it elsewhere if we do end that product. So that's my short answer.
Get one last question from the person I yanked the microphone from. Sorry about that.
It's fine. Hugh Aldridge from UC Berkeley. Yeah. It's a very quick question. You talked at the very beginning about privacy, but you haven't come back to it.
That's true, we haven't.
And we've talked a lot about making information available, but there is also Big Brother. And you were talking about colored dots.
Yes.
What's to stop anybody just linking that dot to a person and then saying, oh, they happen to visit a prostitute on that date?
Well, not only that, these people at Sense Networks can see, they could actually create a tribe of their own of people who don't always sleep in the same house every night, and then they can do all kinds of correlations between that and those people's behavior. And so it's a limitless laboratory for human behavior, and you're right, it can be misused.
Maybe I can say something on it. Well, I think that privacy and the right to forgiveness will be a big questions of this regulation. I say necessary because first of all, there is not exactly the same conception and the same definition of privacy between United States and Europe. For example, here in France, privacy is much more defended than in Great Britain, for example, or United States. Secondly, I think that the capacity of making correlation between information data about one person is becoming more and more powerful. So the question of how you make the data, the personal and private data about an individual safe from malversation is a crucial question. I think that we will need national legislation, regional legislation at the European level and at maybe American level. And after that, we will need a negotiation between Europe and the United States. For example, on the same simple question of augmented television, of connected television, the Google box or the Apple box, now it's impossible for these companies to implement their tools in our country because the legislation on fly advertising are different, you know. So we know that it's not only a question of public policy, but it's also a question of economics. You will not have connected television if there is not a global negotiation about how we fix the rules on the information you can collect on people consuming information, consuming programs, and consuming products and services.
Okay, I think we're out of time. I think we'll wrap it up here. I think we have raised a lot of questions. We've tried to answer them, but really we haven't answered anything because this thing is just beginning. And we're describing a revolution that's just in its early stages. And so hopefully we've given you questions to think about. And thank you very much to the panelists, and thanks to all of you. And we can continue this discussion at lunch.